the question is, what can horse owners do to reduce, equine asthma and prevent it as much as possible? So I think, the management of horses currently is obviously a major impact on equine asthma being an issue, because we know exposure to dust is triggering, especially dust from hay, and again, even good quality hay has dust and mold in it. That's really that's something we can prevent. Obviously, moldy hay is the worst, but even good quality hay has enough that it can trigger it. So it seems that this is an important point to think about, is, how can I lower that exposure, in my horses, essentially. So certainly we know that being outdoor, on pasture when the weather is good, this is ideal. Of course, when weather is getting really cold, especially, in our areas of, upper Midwest or in Canada, the winter is not a friendly space to be on pasture in the middle of the winter. So although when, snow is on the ground, you don't have much dust around. But you need to obviously feed, fiber to your horses, and hay is the certainly cheapest and most convenient way to feed horses. I guess I would recommend a couple of things. What we really know is round bales are the hay that leads to the highest dust exposure, and certainly has been associated with an increased risk of horses developing severe equine asthma or hives. So I would stay away from round bales as much as possible, and especially in horses that show susceptibility or might be coughing a little bit, feeding, square bales from the ground would be definitely preferable in those cases. I know round bales are more convenient and maybe cheaper, but certainly for those horses, at least, that may be susceptible, I would steer away from that. In horses that are actually, already shown signs that I might be already moderate or even severe asthmatic horses, the alternative to hay is to feed them pelleted hay or hay cubes, or complete feed, one or the other. So anything that's pelleted we usually lead to very low level of dust exposure. The other thing that we've shown in prior studies is that adding some source of omega-3 fatty acid in addition, to supplement them with that, helps dramatically, especially horses with moderate to severe signs of asthma. And that can be, in forms of, fish oil, or there are some, commercial products out there that we've tested as well that can be beneficial. And so again, this is a way to control, signs without, medication, just natural supplement. And of course, in horses that, can be controlled with those means, medication, in particular corticosteroids, are the best way to control the signs, and also, bronchodilators for horses that have, increased efforts. So in general, it's to be cognizant of the triggers and try to steer away from, sources of dust exposure. Another recommendation is horses in the barn. When you clean stalls and we, sweep alleyways, that's when you generate a lot of dust exposure. We've done studies where we show when you clean the stall and you move the bedding around and bed with straw, whatnot, dust peaks and takes about an hour to come down to baseline levels. So I would recommend to kick horses out, even if it's cold outside, they'll be fine. They like actually cold weather, and it's pouring rain. And then clean the barn, and then bring them back in, at least an hour later until, dust is down. Also keeping the barn doors open to have good ventilation, and that helps, decrease, dust exposure in the barn. And certainly there are some type of beddings, in addition to the pelleted feed that I mentioned, that can decrease dust exposure. We know that Straw bedding, even though it's the traditional bedding, for horses for many, many years, been the traditional bedding. We know it's one that can lead to higher dust exposure, and wood chips or, a good quality sawdust is actually better. And you have other type of bedding that have been out there also, such as shredded paper or cardboards also that are very low dust. So for those horses that are showing signs, that certainly helps as well, control. And then the little things, like grooming your horse. Obviously, all the dust has settled on your horse, and now you're grooming, and all that is pushed and floating in the air. So think about those things. Either you have those nifty devices, vacuum cleaner type, connected to your brush, or you just do that outside when there's a gentle breeze sweeping away the dust, with the natural, wind, as you groom your horse. So, thinking of all those details. Other thing that would come to mind, and is you trailing your horse to events. A lot of people put a nice hay net, in the van, so the horse has something to do. I'd say, horses don't need to eat unless you're traveling over, many, many hours. But if you're going, to 3, 4, 5 hours away, they really don't need to have any hay in there. So don't add that extra exposure, especially in our study that we did on looking at exposure you generate by placing the hay either in a hay net or on the ground. We know that in the hay net there's 4 times as much dust exposure compared to placing it on the ground. So again, wait until you get to where you are and feed the hay down on the ground, and your horse will be thankful for it. So I think these are kind of the main tips to keep in mind for good respiratory management of your horse.